Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant HEALTH, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, it's been a couple of years now since the Tar Heel State has, for the first time since Reconstruction, if you can get your head around that, had a Republican-controlled General Assembly in place and in the majority, in other words, in power. Welcome again to the most widely watched program on Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William. On this edition, North Carolina's Speaker of the House. He is a representative in the General Assembly from District 98. That includes Mecklenburg County. Over the last 10 years, he has quickly risen from being a rank-and-file member on Cornelius, North Carolina's Parks and Rec Advisory Board to the presiding officer over the House of Representatives in a powerful political post in the Old North State, the Honorable Thom Tillis.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, health care, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising health care costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded September 28, 2012. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring Thom Tillis, Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives. Now, Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program, and thank you for watching, Your Honor. It's good to have you here, and thank you. Welcome back.
It's my pleasure. Good to be back.
Thank you. You know, Mr. Speaker, there are so many things going on in the Tar Heel State that we want to talk to you about. Let's start fairly broad with the Republican Party. You watch and probably see many more polls than I do or that we do in general. When you watch what's happening in presidential politics, when you see this shift that Hispanics used to be in the Republican Party and now they're clearly on the other side of the aisle, when you see all of these things that have transpired, what do you think about what is going on in the Republican Party?
Well, I think it has more to do with what's going on in the demographics of this country and recognizing that and then having a platform and a message that resonates. You know, if you take a look, you mentioned the Hispanic population, the African American population. There's a number of things that our party stands for that they embrace. I think we have to do a better job of communicating it. I think we have to do a better job of being out there in between elections, garnering support for the things that we're trying to advance. And I think we need a focus on limited government and free markets, which is something that's appealing to everybody. That kind of work will position us for those growing sectors. You know, the traditional population in North Carolina and in the United States is more or less stable. It's not growing. The African American population is roughly growing, but the Hispanic population and the other immigrant populations are growing in significant numbers. We've got to resonate with those future voters.
So as you watch what's going on, and let's bring it to the presidential candidate Mitt Romney. When you watch what happened with his campaign and are watching that, does the top of the ticket, in this case presidential politics, does the top of the ticket have the same impact down through the organization in states like North Carolina, or are those two separate issues now?
Well, it will have some impact, but as you would expect, we're doing a lot of polling and we're taking a look at our House candidates' positions relative to Pat McCrory and to Governor Romney. And in some cases, they trend in the same directions. In other cases, they diverge. The key to the down ballot races is to communicate a message and have an informed vote. And keep in mind, there are more than 1 million unaffiliated voters who are not going to go in and punch a ticket. They're going to make some of the most informed decisions, and they are typically the demographic that influence most of the elections.
And this is in North Carolina.
That's right.
Only 1
That's
million
right.
unaffiliated.
Over 1 million. In fact, there are some 3 million Democrats, about 2 million Republicans, so they are absolutely essential to the outcomes. So it does have an effect. And Pat Romney, I should say Pat Romney, Mayor McCrory has a significant effect. He is very popular across this state, and we're seeing it have a positive impact on a number of our races. So it's really complicated. The off-year elections are a lot easier to understand the dynamic than the presidential elections, but I'm very confident about our House races, very confident about Mayor McCrory, and I'm optimistic about Governor Romney covering the state.
You really want to put those two together, don't you?
Well, it's because I feel very strongly that both of them need to be in executive positions. It's critical to the country. It's critical to the future of North Carolina.
Well, and let's talk about the executive branch in North Carolina. Let's say let's start with Walter Dalton. Let's say Walter Dalton wins the election. You've got a Republican-controlled General Assembly, as you've had now enjoyed for a couple of years now, and you've got a Democratic governor. How do you break out of some of the same old politics that have gone on about Democrats and Republicans working together, or do you see that?
Well, we already did. I think probably the most underreported news over the last 2 years is the extent to which bipartisan cooperation got so many things done. There are 52 Democrats in the minority caucus. 18 of them have voted with us on one or more of the veto overrides. I was at a meeting with speakers of the House recently, and I talked about that story, and all of them to a person said that's never been done in their state. That to me is bipartisan cooperation. We couldn't find a willing governor, but we found people to override 2 vetoes of a budget that balanced the budget, medical malpractice reform, regulatory reform. A litany of business-oriented bills went through this legislature with strong bipartisan support. So we've proven we can work with the other side. We'd like to work with a willing governor so that we can advance more policies and get the economy back on track.
Let's talk about working within the party. Mr. Speaker Tillis, you've got, like I said, you've had a couple of years of great success, in no small part and effort to you and many others in the party, but you've got 50% of, and I hope to say this right, and please do correct me, I'm certainly not the last word on this, but you've got 50% of the legislative body now with less than 4 years of experience. You've got a lot of freshmen. Some of them are Tea Partiers, some of them are libertarian thinking, some of them are just old-line Republicans. How do you herd these cats? And what will the challenge be going forward with that issue?
Well, I think a lot of people, well, that was said about me because I'm a relative newcomer. I was in my 4th year when I was nominated and elected Speaker, about institutional knowledge and legislative experience. But I would, again, I'd have to go back to our results to disprove any inference you could draw from the question you asked. We had some 21 freshmen. We had a $3 billion deficit, the worst fiscal situation since the Great Depression. We had a year where we had to do redistricting. We had an unwilling governor, and I didn't have a super majority. We had to work together and create bipartisan support to get things done. In spite of all those obstacles, we had the shortest session since 1973. And the most productive session in terms of the business agenda that any business person, the State Chamber of Commerce, can recognize. So there are ways to get this stuff done. A lot of them were in the structural changes that we made, cutting out 1/3 of the standing committees so that we didn't get things clogged up in committees, limiting the number of bills that members could file to the ones that they sincerely wanted to move forward. So we made those structural changes, and it produced, I think, very positive results. Our freshmen also are a top-notch group of people, and I should say there are some in the minority caucus that have done great things in this session. So I think it's a matter of playing them up, having them more involved versus having to play their freshman term out and then hopefully get things done in the following term. We had more substantive legislation carried by freshmen this year than anyone can remember. And I think now that experience will also transfer over to the freshman class coming in. I'm very optimistic about the results we'll get done next year.
And let's talk about next year. You've got issues on the table like transportation. You've got energy exploration that's recently come up. You've got education, and frankly speaking, you know, Republicans, accurate or not, have this draconian brand that they want to that you want to gut education. So talk a little bit about what you really hope to get done.
Yeah, well, on education, I spent 4 hours this week at a strategic planning meeting with the university systems and community colleges. folks need to go talk to those, to the people leading in our community colleges and universities and ask them their opinion about the work that we're doing. We're engaging with them. We're trying to figure out ways to give them more flexibility to do more things, get the expertise on the ground that really knows how to run those institutions and empower them to do it. So we worked through a very difficult fiscal time that we had to work through. K through 12, the same thing. We do need to work on improving public K through 12 education. But I firmly believe that most of the good ideas and most of the things that we need to do are in the minds of the teachers, the principals, and the superintendents, not a bunch of legislators in Raleigh. What we need to do is facilitate that. There's a lot of great things going on across the state that we just need to figure out how it applies and expedite it being done in the problem school districts. If we do that, we'll do a great job with K through 12 education. I'm very optimistic that by the end of this term, that the principals, the teachers will get past all the rhetoric, will get past all the special interests that are trying to influence what we're doing, but the real stakeholders will be happy with what we produce.
When you look at, let's stay with those educators for just a moment, Mr. Speaker. You look at Wake County schools, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. You see Anthony Tata not long ago has lost his job, and I mean, you can almost look in any major metro, the triad, the triangle, and we all shake our heads and wonder what goes on in some of these school board meetings. You've got Scott Rawls at the community college system, you got Tom Ross at the university system, you got Davidson, you got Duke. When they've been on this program, when we had public dialogues, they all feel at risk and out there, and maybe not Davidson so much, but they feel like they're really having a tough road to hoe. Tom Ross was on this program not long ago and was concerned about funding for this system, cost cutting certainly, but funding from the legislature. So how do you make educators, how do you bring them into the fold? How do you make them part of that dialogue where they do have some confidence that the output of these schools is really going to get better?
Just what you said. Actually, I just had dinner with Tom Ross, spent 2 hours with him on Monday night. I spend a lot of time talking with him, with Scott Rawls and the leaders of the community colleges and universities. You communicate with them. You find ways. At the strategic planning meeting that we had that had the community colleges, Tom was there. I've spent 5 hours with Tom Ross this week, indicative of my investment in education. The idea is to get them involved. My past experience is in large, complex organizations trying to solve problems as a management consultant. And invariably, the best ideas come from the executives and the workers in those institutions, not from the outside, not going and taking a model from somewhere else and say, guys, just do this, but figure out what they need. At the strategic planning meeting, I asked them to go take a look at every line of every statute that governs community colleges and universities and tell me what changes we need to make. Don't necessarily assume that you've got to operate within the construct that the legislature has set forth before. Let's rethink that as well and free them to think about modernizing and making more competitive an already very competitive system.
You know, I'm sorry, but sometimes I get lost in the dialogue, and I'm waiting for the next word about the education. Let me take it in a different direction. Some of the challenges coming up. You've got tax reform, you've got energy exploration, you've got transportation. Let's spend some time on tax reform. You have said privately, and you certainly said publicly, that you want to work on tax reform. We've got personal income tax, we've got corporate tax, we've got sales tax. Personal income tax by far is the lion's share of receipts for North Carolina. Walk us through a structure on what really would work when we come to major tax reform.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do is go back, not unlike what Paul Ryan has said at the federal level, and taking a look at all the exceptions that have occurred over time and determining whether or not they're rational and fair exceptions. Okay, so that's a part of the base that's been taken out. There are some that have never been considered. So what we're trying to do is evolve to a more consumption-oriented model that gets away from corporate income tax and personal income tax and then fairly taxes consumption at the point of consumption. Also dealing with the regressive nature for low-income families. We've got to protect them, but there are ways to do it. And it may be somewhere between an all-out elimination of corporate and personal income taxes strictly to a consumption model such as Tennessee. And all of those sorts of alternatives are being looked at now. We also have to be very careful with the way tax policy affects the strategic sectors, the industry that we think North Carolina is best positioned to grow and as compared to our competition. So health sciences, biotechnology, agriculture, military sector. All of these things have to be taken into account because we don't want to end up with a broad-based lower rate, which actually puts us at a strategic disadvantage. So it's a very complex process, something we started working on last year, and we'll continue after the elections to get into the details and see if it's something we can get done next year.
When you look at Tennessee, that's a good example, though, Mr. Speaker. You look at Tennessee, and the volatility between their receipts in any given year, the best of the best and the worst of the worst get better and they get worse. So. Yeah. That's got to be a concern to you, that state tax receipts, wherever they come from, the spread is going to become larger.
It is, but a part of what you can do with a broadened base is find industries and taxing events that are counter-cyclical. In other words, certain industries that are up in the down times that offset industries that are down in the down times.
Can you manage through that type of cycle, or is that just a...
I think you can, and I think actually if there is any silver lining, and I don't think that there is in this economic downturn, is that some of the tax reform measures that have taken place in the United States over the last decade can now be viewed in terms of the stress test. How well have they actually done in this economic downturn? And we're using that to instruct us on whether or not it does make sense to completely eliminate personal income tax, for example, versus dramatically reduce it and have, I think, a more diversified tax base, broadened but also diversified in terms of the mix between consumption and production-oriented taxes.
Let's go back to the point you made about regressive taxes. And you want to be regressive sensitive, I understand that. But still, wouldn't you be worried if you broaden the base, lower the rate, that you'd still be raising taxes on some of those folks?
Invariably, if you broaden the base, by definition, it means things are going to be taxed that haven't been taxed before. Right. So then the question becomes, is it rational, is it fair? And that may serve as a basis for some future exemptions. But we have to take a look at, I've told my staff, I've told my colleagues in the Senate, we have to come up with specific kitchen table examples, specific boardroom examples that we can bring to industries, that we can bring to different demographics and say, this is a fair way to derive revenue for the state. But by no means will we raise any more money than the state's raised today. And if I have anything to do with it, it'll be slightly less, which actually brings me to another important piece of this whole, you can't look at tax reform in a vacuum. There are other things in terms of the cost of doing business or the cost of owning a household that we should look at. Regulatory reform, continuing at the state level but local level to try and take cost out. And also, there's still a lot that we can do to make our government more efficient. The reform of government, the cost of running government, to reduce the overall tax burden so that we can either use that as a part of our tax reform measure or redeploying the revenues to education, for example.
You know, with your management consulting background, the PwC time that you spent, I mean, you get the calculus of business and public policy and how flows move and how balance sheets move. But do you worry that you talk about making a kitchen table or an elevator presentation? Do most voters, do a lot of voters, do a majority of voters have that kind of attention that they want to pay to that?
Well, much of what I just said would not resonate with anybody around the kitchen table, including my own kitchen table. So a part of what we have to do is discuss, and I actually had this discussion yesterday. I said, guys, people don't care about tax rates and regression and broaden base, lower the rate. I mean, those are all just platitudes. What we need to do is say to a typical family who has an income of $30,000 or $40,000 and they typically buy these kinds of things, are they going to have more or less at the end of the day? Or the same, but maybe less likely that their taxes are going to go up because they've got a tax system that's more stable, can withstand more fluctuations in the economy. We've got to communicate it that way. Are we going to provide them with more opportunities to buy a car or pay for maintenance on the used car? Are we going to give them more opportunities to buy food or the things that they need for their kids? We've got to learn to communicate it at that level. That's how the average person thinks, and that's how we should be communicating.
And you know, the average person thinks about the rate of unemployment in North Carolina is creeping up again, closing in on 10%. You know, this is, I guess the question is here, what do we need to do to bring that down?
Well, there are a number of things. One is we need an administration in Washington that produces optimism and encourages business to invest and grow and take risk. And that doesn't exist. It hasn't existed for the last 4 years and arguably the last 6 or 8 years. So we need some help from Washington. Until the national economy begins to trend forward, we're going to continue to have problems in North Carolina, but there are still things we can do. I firmly believe that regulatory reform is one of the most important things that we can do. Reducing the risk and uncertainty for people who choose to run a business or continuing to run a business, and the distractions of regulations. This is not with any intent to reduce our commitment to protecting the environment, air quality, workplace safety, but it's looking at these regulations and saying, do they make sense? Mm-hmm. Does the cost of them and the distraction to the business prevent them from actually doing their business? And if we look at those kinds of things, I believe that we can make progress around the margins. But make no mistake about it, our economy, just as Europe's economy goes the way of the U.S. and vice versa, the state of North Carolina cannot operate in a vacuum. We're a part of a region and a part of a nation whose economy has to turn around before you'll see substantial improvements. But I do think we can get to a point where you'll see a downward trend and economic growth that hopefully will have us trending better than our peer states in the Southeast.
You know, statutorily, North Carolina, and again, congratulations to you, both Republicans and Democrats, for taking on the whole issue of fracking and making it, at least at this point, legal to do in North Carolina. Next step is how we go about that. So I guess the question would be, what are the barriers to drilling? What are the barriers to really, truly expanding this energy frontier? And how long is it going to take to start seeing a real impact in North Carolina?
I think it could take as much as 2 years before we have the regulatory environment back before the legislature for approval. The average citizen doesn't probably understand that while the fracking was made legal, there was also a moratorium on it pending the regulatory framework we need to do it safely, environmentally sound, and preserving the property rights and addressing those issues and the regulations that are already beginning to be promulgated. So what they're doing right now is to get all that work in place. We also need to understand that since the price of natural gas has gone down substantially, that time frame is probably okay, because there are existing gas fields that the companies that would come in and ultimately maybe drill here are extracting today. So this is probably a 3 to 5 year proposition. The reason it was so important to pass the bill now is to send the very clear message that we are interested in doing this if we can be convinced that we can do it safely, preserving water quality, preserving air quality, and preserving overall safety for the state. That's why we were so intent on overriding the veto, so that we could get that work done. And then I would guess maybe the 2014 legislature, but possibly the 2015 legislature would be when we take that matter up.
Does it ensure that North Carolina will be first mover in the Southeast on this?
I think so. I think that the fact that we've moved forward, that we should, for a variety of reasons. One, just the deposits that we have here, but the fact that we've made this intent, people will begin investing. There will be some private activity to promote this. So it's already, I think, sending the very clear message we want to do that. And incidentally, we need to be equally focused on staking our claim and advancing our interest for oil reserves off the coast of North Carolina, about 30 miles in 200 feet of water, reserves that could completely change the game in terms of revenues available to the state and economic development. That's obviously tangled up in federal regulations, but we shouldn't lose sight of that. It makes the natural gas extraction on land pale in comparison to the opportunity just off our coast. And 200 feet of water is very shallow. I think Deepwater Horizon was at 5,000 feet. It's a safe depth to drill in. There are significant deposits there. It's very important for our national security and certainly for the North Carolina's economic security to figure out how we do that and get it going.
Is there any idea, any projections on how much we're talking about? What kind of economic impact in North Carolina?
I have not seen, I know I can't give you the specific numbers, but the deposits off the eastern shelf are significant, not just in North Carolina, but off of Virginia, South Carolina. So there's significant opportunities out there, and a part of what we have to do to answer your question definitively is send the message to the industries, to researchers, that we're willing to look at it. It would not make any business sense to spend a lot of time to go beyond the seismic data that they have today, the other data that they have today, to go any further if they think there's no chance that they're ever going to be allowed to do it.
I wish we had more time to go down that road. We didn't talk about a lot of things. We didn't talk about transportation, but I hope you know you are welcome to come back, but we'd like you to come back and keep the dialogue. Would you do that?
Oh, I'd love to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Anytime.
We got you on record. That's a good thing. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, good to have you on the program.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for watching our program. We hope your business and your weekend, of course, are good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant HEALTH, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.